Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of CatalystWest Conversations. It's really good to be back in the host chair this week. I'm Helen Barcham, and today's episode we focus on migration. Now, in a little while, I'm going to introduce our two esteemed guests, but before I do, I just want to take a moment to talk to you all and to remind you that this is a conversation, it's not a lecture. We'd love for you all to be part of that. So using the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen, you can post your comments and your questions to us and help us steer the conversation. You'll also see on your screen right now a CatalystWest polling. We want to know about you, who you are, and how you're experiencing this COVID-19 situation as it unfolds. So please take the time to fill out our poll. Now, we are one, but we are many. It's etched into our national anthem, and our leaders are always very bold in coming out and proclaiming that Australia is the most successful multicultural story on earth. But the events over the last few months are proving to be quite complex. We've seen, for example, our borders closed for the last 2 months, and there's still a lingering sense of uncertainty on when they will reopen. Some new government figures are showing that, or indicating that come 2021, our migration intake will probably see about an 85% decline. Now, today we've got lots of bold and big questions to answer and to unpack, including, you know, what are these changes likely to mean for Australia socially, economically, and importantly, what is it likely to mean for our national identity, which is very much predicated on this idea that we are open, we are multicultural, and we are cosmopolitan. Well, to help me unpack these big and bold questions, I've got two guests here. The first is Melissa Monteiro, who is CEO of the Community Migrant Resource Centre, among other hats that she wears. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. Good to be on this program with you, Helen, and with you, Shanti.
Yes.
Hello to you, everyone.
Great. And Shanti, Associate Professor Shanti Robertson, I should add, is Social and Migration Researcher here at Western Sydney University and joins us again. Welcome, Shanti.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So in a moment, we're going to deep dive into a political conversation about migration. But before we do, I thought it's important that we open this talk today by asking you both. I mean, you both work in different capacities with people on the ground, migrants and migrant communities. What are some of the stories that they're sharing and the experiences that they're having now through this pandemic? I might start with you, please, Melissa.
Helen, I'm very encouraged by the number of activities, especially in Western Sydney, and the number of online platforms in different languages that have attempted to reach as many in the community that we actually serve in Western Sydney. The young people and the youth transition support programs that are existent in Blacktown, Auburn, and in Parramatta, really they have organized an online Q&A for young people to ask their questions about the laws and restrictions in relation to COVID-19. And this was done with the Marital Legal Centre. Hundreds of young people participated. Early intervention and parenting programs that have happened again in Western Sydney, improving parenting skills during this time and the challenges faced with COVID. Again, young people, educators, and parents alike transitioning to online study has been really a big challenge, and we found that little enclaves of young people and groups all over discussing exactly how. We've got a discovery program that is actually has been tested already, where we've actually helping young people and to transition, especially migrants and refugees, to transition across from high school to TAFE, to university, and to employment. And that has been successful with our young people and our tutoring and our mentoring programs. Virtually, this has happened for young people with a few hundred young people again in Western Sydney. We've had in Western Sydney free online career planning courses to help communities, whether it is men, women, or children, or young adults, young people, to get enough support and find employment during this COVID time. There has been, Helen, a lot of anxiety in the community, and you can't say that there hasn't been stress and anxiety, but I think today it's important that we as community recognize the levels of stress, but also recognize the levels of community activation, community support, young people, groups, ethnic organizations, agencies, church groups, universities, everyone pitching in to actually make a difference to this time that we're going through.
Yeah, it sounds like some important work happening. What about you, Shanti? Are you hearing similar things?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear from Melissa actually about what ethnic community organisations and sector organisations are experiencing on the ground. I think it's important to remember that our migrant communities are experiencing a lot of the same issues that are present in the rest of the community: financial distress, economic uncertainty, issues around mental health to do with physical distancing. I think the general set of problems and anxieties that we're all experiencing, our migrant communities are really experiencing those as well. I think there are a couple of specific issues that are affecting transnational families in particular around border closures. There's another layer of complicated mental health and social support issues that come in when people's support networks are not all local and they're not all in Australia. So because there hasn't been as much family reunion in our migration program over the last 25 years or so, a lot of people are separated from their families. Whether that's from extended family or immediate family, and their families might be struggling in their home countries around the world with different levels of restriction and different levels of risk too. So with the border closures, not knowing when you might be able to see family members again is something that I think people are really struggling with. I think alongside some of the issues Melissa's identified, I think some of the migrant groups that are probably most affected by COVID are those on temporary visas. So that includes members of the refugee community that don't have permanent protection, but also, as people are probably aware, those on skilled temporary visas, student visas, working holiday visas, basically any visa when your stay in Australia is a little bit uncertain, particularly stressful for those whose visas are attached to their employment. And in those industries that have been hit quite hard by the COVID shutdown, there's often an overrepresentation of temporary migrant workers in some of those industries, like hospitality or cleaning. Please forgive the cameos of cat ears and cat tails. I've just actually given up trying to keep them off Zoom, so I hope people don't mind.
No,
so there are a couple of...
That's a welcome. This is CatalystWest Conversations after all. So
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, so there are a couple of key issues going on there which will continue to unfold, I think, over the next 6 to 12 months.
Interesting. I mean, Melissa, I think one of the key things that you raised there was that it's, you know, it's about the whole community coming together, industry, community groups, you know, institutions like churches and otherwise to you know, pitch in and support. But let's talk for now about the role of government in all of this. Scott Morrison, once the pandemic kind of started, Scott Morrison was very clear about his position with the job seeker program and the fact that, you know, temporary migrants were never going to be part of that. In fact, he says, and I quote, "As much as it's lovely to have visitors to Australia in good times, at times like this, if you're a visitor in this country and unable to support yourself, it's time to make your way home." Now, what this means is over about 1 million people are going without welfare assistance, many of which, as you noted, Shanti, are people whose, you know, jobs and employment have been affected. Shanti, I guess a question for you firstly, how does this decision by our government fare internationally? What are governments elsewhere doing?
Governments elsewhere are taking quite different approaches, actually. So in the UK, for example, visa holders are being given the same welfare benefit, which is about 80% of their previous salary, that other local workers are being given. So that's one situation I'm more familiar with. So, you know, Morrison's approach isn't that similar to what other migrant receiving nations are doing elsewhere. I think with his statements, I do think there's been a bit of a shift since he first said, you know, temporary migrants really just need to go home. I think particularly state and local governments are taking a bit of a different approach in different parts of Australia because they really see the value of that particular community. I think the thing that I probably take most issue with in those comments is the idea that these migrants are visitors. I think what people often don't understand about our temporary migration program is that you can be here for, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years as a temporary migrant. So at this point, I don't think we can consider people to be visitors. These are members of our communities that are long-term taxpayers that have homes here. Some of them have partners who are Australian citizens. Some of them have children that have spent the vast majority of their lives in Australia. So this idea that everyone's a short-term visitor and can easily return home, I think is actually not quite accurate to the situation of many people out there. I think as well, it's really important to recognise that people who can easily return home will, because if they're in a difficult situation here and they're not eligible for welfare payments, those who can go and return to a better situation absolutely will. But with border closures, with the intensities of things that are happening in other source cities around the world, some people don't have safe homes or safe conditions to go back to. Some people don't have access to the money to pay for flights, and other people have an entire life here. You know, they have homes, leases, kids in school, jobs and communities that they really care about and they want to continue to participate in. So it's not quite as simple, I think, as that proposition that they're visitors and they can return home.
Yeah, Melissa, how are these comments by the government being received by migrant communities? Are they angry? Do they understand? Yeah, what are some of the stories that you're hearing there? And I guess the second part to that question is, do you think that's going to splinter our relationships, our geopolitical relations, once people in countries overseas understand how you know, the approach that we've taken?
Look, the first question, I think, as I've mentioned before, there's a lot of anxiety, Helen, in the community, especially with regard to temporary people on temporary visas. We need to recognize and understand that the fact that they are in Australia, you know, outlined by Shanti in these various capacities, they are contributing members to the economy. They're working hard, they're contributing. And really, this should not be a debate about how much they're contributing and about this migration and their visa status, etc. It should be a conversation really about a program that recognizes really their contribution to Australia over these last. International students, for example, take international students, they contribute like, what, $40 billion to the economy, and that's huge. And I have worked a lot in the last few months, especially with Shanti, the groups that you were talking about, with refugees, with migrant communities, with international students, and there is definitely anxiety on all sides. People have lost their jobs, no doubt, but the JobKeeper is good to an extent that it is temporary and it is going to be, you know, it's for the next, say, few months. After that, what? So that level of anxiety is there in the community. We have at different points in time, the FECA has communicated with the department, or with the government. The Settlement Council has communicated and has recently co-signed a letter with the department, again raising it with the with government, that there are these levels of anxiety and that this should be recognized in by government, really.
Yeah, I think that leads nicely to a comment that's just been made by Peter Hutchins, which is around, you know, Morrison's statement exhibits both social ignorance, as Shanti has noted, but also economic ignorance, failing to understand how migration has been a long-term economic driver for Australia. And that leads really nicely to the next question, which is that, you know, Morrison and the Treasurer have come out and said, you know, it'd cost $20 billion to include or to extend the JobKeeper program to these communities, which is something that we can't afford at the moment. But is that, I guess, is that short-term, you know, $20 billion, is it likely, if we don't support these people now, are the implications going to cost us more than $20 billion? I mean, not just in that economic sense, but what it does to our image and our management of this whole situation.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that Peter's made there, which I really would like to pick up on if I could, Helen. I think, you know, Christina Keneally's points, I think it was last week, were quite similar too, in terms of, okay, we're facing an economic recession, we're facing a really constricted labour market, and then that means we should be starting to restrict our migration program. But as Peter's identified, most economists really agree that migration plays a far more complex role in the economy than just filling places within a labour market, right? Migration actually is shown to drive economic growth, so it creates jobs as well as fills jobs. So it's never as simple as saying, well, if we take one migrant out of the labour market, that opens up a job for a local worker. It just doesn't work that way. It's more complex. In terms of that 20 billion figure, I mean, I don't know where that number's come from or how it's been forecast, so I can't comment on that specifically. But I absolutely think there will be some kind of long-term implications because we are going to need migration for economic recovery, and we're definitely still, in an ongoing sense, going to need to fill some of those key roles in the labour market in the short term. Christina Keneally highlighted focusing on training for local workers, which I think absolutely is a critical part of the picture here as we head into recovery. But there's also going to be a need to fill critical jobs in the immediate term, particularly in areas like, for example, healthcare. So it needs to be a broader discussion. In terms of the motivations for some of this political rhetoric, well, migrants are a really easy scapegoat for any kind of economic problem, and we kind of see that again and again in the political discourse. If we're having infrastructural problems in cities, for example, if our hospitals are under pressure, if our roads are too crowded, if our schools are too crowded, if people are looking at high unemployment figures, it seems like such a neat and easy policy solution to say, well, migration is the issue here. If we address that, then we address all of these other problems. But of course, these problems are actually more complicated and require different kinds of policy investments beyond just making cuts to the migration program. So I think we're going to have to see how that plays out over the next 12 months. I think it's also worth noting, despite the fact that Liberal governments, coalition governments, often seem to make these anti-migration sentiments, migration numbers, particularly skilled and temporary migration numbers, always remain very high under the coalition governments that we've seen. And that's generally because business lobbies really do support a healthy migration program. So there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes between discourses and what actually happens politically, I would say.
Yeah, interesting.
Can I?
Yeah, sure, Melissa.
I just say that I fully agree with Shanti, and I would like to say that with regard to Christina Keneally's comment that she's made, I think it would have been very wise to avoid using language that pits new migrants against citizens in relation to jobs and employment. We cannot allow migration to become as politically and socially divisive as it has been in the past. Can I say that FECA and SCOA have written to the government and have actually spoken about growth fueled, and I'm reading out in our letter to the government. It says growth fueled by migration will continue to be a key economic driver in the future, as you just mentioned, Shanti. The suggestion that migration creates competition for Australian jobs ignores the views of countless economic experts and the findings of federal government reports, which show that migrants don't take local jobs, they help create them.
Yeah, we're seeing that that rhetoric about, you know, migrants taking jobs re-emerge, you know, again, just in different ways. There's been the reception to Christina Keneally's op-ed has been quite interesting. You know, some accusing her of, you know, dog whistling and, you know, her comments being mired in xenophobia, and others saying, no, it's simply economic, which is interesting. And it brings me to a point that you touched on slightly, Melissa, and something that you've written about before, Shanti, which is How do we now, given you know, the kind of unprecedented scale of jobs and job losses that we're facing at the moment, how do we take that seriously and talk about labour and shortages there without reducing migrants, as you've said before, Shanti? They are not labour, they are people. How do we correct or steer that discourse in a healthy way that sees these people as people? That's to either of you.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to think about there, right? And I think one of the key things we can really look for when we discuss these issues is who are we talking about when we talk about migrants? Because migrants are a very diverse group in Australian society. There are people from migrant backgrounds, for example, who were born in Australia. There are people who are here temporarily, permanently under our humanitarian program. So I think in terms of the discourse, it's important to think about what kind of subtle forms of racialisation sometimes happen in these discussions. So for example, one of the largest components of our migration program is our Trans-Tasman Agreement, where New Zealand citizens are able to come and live and work in Australia. So that's a really large number of our temporary migrant workforce, for example. If people aren't willing to look at that migration program, but they're saying we really should be shutting down skilled migration from China and India, for example, then you're not looking at someone making a neutral argument about migration. You're looking at someone making a highly racialised argument about the kinds of people that they want to have in Australia. So that's kind of part of it, right? We need to look for these subtle forms of racialisation, which are not actually anti-migration, they're anti-certain types of people and have an inherent kind of racism attached to them. So that's kind of one thing that I would really say there. And I mean, also just some of this rhetoric of Australian jobs for Australians, that really comes down to how are you defining an Australian? If you see a non-white person taking up a job in a local business, do you automatically assume that's a migrant taking away a job from a local worker? So when we talk about things like our migrant workforce, who are we actually talking about? What do we assume that they look like? What do we assume is actually an Australian when we talk about Australian jobs for Australians? And the boundaries around that, I think, are something that are really highly contested. So, you know, as I said before, do you say that someone who has been in Australia for 10 years but doesn't have permanent residency, who is to say that they are or aren't an Australian and part of our Australian community? Where are the boundaries around that? So that's a kind of ongoing critical conversation I think it's quite important to have, rather than making broad statements that make very definitive but also very unclear divisions between who is a migrant and who isn't a migrant.
Yes. Helen, we need only to look to the past for signs of how dangerous an us versus them framing of this debate can be, and how quickly sparks of anti-immigration rhetoric can be latched on to by political opportunists and commentators and fanned to become raging fires of community division. And that is what my letter to the government said. We said that the need, this is SCOA, said the need for reform does exist to address the shift in the migration program away from permanency and towards temporary workers as a solution to fill gaps in the workforce. From the perspective of migrants, Shanti, successful reform will deliver more streamlined pathways to permanent residency and improve social cohesion by placing greater value on permanency rather than temporary migration. Determining the right level of migration numbers will also benefit businesses seeking to attract highly skilled workers and prevent skills shortages and facilitate partner and family reunion, because that's something that's always left out of the mix, which helps to bring strong communities. Finally, I'd like to say that we are at a juncture in the debate on immigration policy. Either we can allow it to become a political football that leads the discussion down a path to increase xenophobia, which is another outcome and another issue of, will be an outcome at the end of it all. Or we can take this opportunity to create a framework for a sustainable, transparent, and a fair immigration program. That's my take on just to respond to what Shanti was saying.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll come now to a question from Ali. She says, if we keep our borders closed for years, what would no migration Australia look like? Is that a possibility?
Can I just respond and say firstly that migration has helped Australia to evolve into this very rich and successful modern nation. The success has been built mostly on the back of migration programs that facilitate permanency and encourage residents to fully participate in our economy and society as citizens. Recently, however, the composition of our migration program had shifted to include the ever-increasing numbers of temporary visa holders. If this were to take place, it would be very disastrous. It wouldn't be the best. And I'm saying that we as a country have been built on migration. So closing our doors and closing it down for that long period of time is going to be disastrous for us, if that answers her question.
Yeah, I mean, Helen, I kind of want to flip that question a little bit to another side of this debate, which I think we don't talk about very often. So if we talk about border closures, and if we think about a global world where there are a lot of border closures, well, what does an Australia look like when no Australians can go out either? You know, our multiculturalism and our sense of ourselves as a cosmopolitan kind of democracy doesn't just come from migrants who come in. It also comes from Australians' experiences of going overseas and the really strong transnational connections at the level of family, at the level of business, at the level of, you know, not-for-profit and civic practice that lots of Australians maintain overseas. And I think we can't forget, Australia sends a lot of our local young people to have overseas experiences as well. There are lots of Australians, for example, now who are living in London who are benefiting from the welfare provisions that the UK government is providing to non-citizens. So it's not a one-way sense of directionality for Australia. There's actually a really big Australian diaspora spread throughout the world. There are many Australians whose family networks and business networks are very, very transnational. So if we think about, well, what does border closure look like and what might some of the consequences of border closure be, we've got to think about those consequences as well. Like, how do our connections outward change?
Yeah, and that's interestingly not been much of the focus in these public conversations, has it, around border closures? It's been around kind of who's coming in and not who can leave. Why do you think that's the case?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, I think in general, what the COVID crisis has done has made people think very domestically and has brought a lot of focus onto local economy, domestic economy, national questions. So I think that's sort of at the moment a natural consequence of the political discourse sitting in that direction. But I think as well, you know, Australia, and in a general sense, we don't really think of Australians who leave and go and live overseas as migrants or immigrants. We tend to use different kinds of terms to describe them, like expats, for example. But when actually, you know, again, it's about, well, who fits that definition of a migrant and who doesn't? A lot of them really are migrants, and they're going on different permanent and temporary visa categories, or they're going because they have relationships or job opportunities or whatever it is overseas. Exactly the same kinds of motivations and practices as people coming here. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as well. You know, the numbers are probably a lot smaller, but Australia does have a diaspora, and part of our part of the nature of our multicultural society and part of the nature of our strong connections overseas are also those outward facing links. So I think it's worth just considering the impact of that as well. I mean, when you think about how significant overseas experiences can be for young people today, that's one of the areas of research I'm focusing on at the moment. You know, many young people in Australia really set out a life plan which involves some period of time living, working, studying, traveling overseas. And what's going to happen to those kinds of experiences and the long-term economic, cultural and civic benefits that they bring if we're looking at long-term border closures as well.
Melissa, did you have something to add there? I could see you nodding away.
I was fully agreeing with Shanti, and in fact, I'm keen to know more about what you're doing with your research. If you can just highlight a little more of, you know, the recent months, what you've been doing in this COVID period especially, would be good. Shanti.
Oh gosh, that's such a tough question, Melissa, because the COVID period as a migration researcher, it's really thrown a lot of our research projects and a lot of our research questions into a little bit of chaos. But the project I was referring to is called the Youth Mobilities, Aspirations and Pathways Project, and that's a longitudinal study of 2,000 transnationally mobile young people. Half of those are young young people coming into Australia for different work, study and life experiences. And half of those are young Australians who are going out of Australia to have that time overseas in whatever form it takes. So really, really interested in comparing and contrasting those experiences and in tracking young people over about 5 years to say, okay, what actually are the long-term outcomes for people, whether that's on their employment and their career pathways, whether that's on their civic practice and sense of citizenship, or whether that's in the social realm in terms of the relationships that they maintain transnationally. So I've noticed that Katie has just popped up in the chat to say 8% of the Australian workforce is based overseas, and I actually didn't know that figure, so that's really good to know. That's really not an insignificant amount of people. And their connections are really significant economically, diplomatically, in a number of different ways. So, I mean, the Youth Mobilities Project, we really do have to pivot our research focus a little bit now because the COVID context is definitely changing things. Yeah. But we're hoping in the next couple of years to have some really solid data in what the consequences and impacts are of young people on being mobile during that life stage. Yes. And that's, you know, it's tracking everyone from young entrepreneurs that are living in Bali to people working in finance in London to people who are doing an extended backpacking experience in South America. It's really trying to capture those range of experiences that people undertake.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And also if you've got like refugees and humanitarian entrants in your mix.
No, we're only looking at voluntary migrants because we think that those people whose mobility is involuntary and is forced, that's really a very different category with a different set of vulnerabilities and issues. So yeah, it's not a refugee-focused study.
Excellent.
Speaking of though, Melissa, they're a cohort that haven't really been kind of represented in these very already limited public conversations that are unfolding now. And I understand that you work with refugee and asylum seeker communities. Are their experiences at the moment, you know, very different to what we've spoken about to date?
Not very different, but I guess the same, like Shanti was alluding to, you know, the same as all of the other populations and groups in the country. Sometimes I refer to them only as a double disadvantage sometimes because communication probably at some time, for example, a communication gap, maybe you make it more harder. For example, a mom without, you know, good language skills and proficiency in English, etc., homeschooling her young one at home makes it double harder. So if you look at whether it is the employment or the communication or the housing or the whatever it is, every one of those areas makes it during this time a double disadvantage for someone from that background, put it that way. So we've found and we're finding, and that's why we've had to step up, and a lot of the settlement agencies, and I'm in touch with settlement agencies, Helen, across the country, because we've got over a membership of over 120 settlement agencies throughout Australia who are all stepping up and who have got fantastic, fabulous examples of partnering, say, with the Red Cross or partnering with other settlement agencies in the country to be able to meet the needs of our migrant and our refugee communities during this time. And asylum seekers and humanitarian entrants, like I said, who face maybe an increased risk or an increased disadvantage compared to the general populations.
Yeah, Shanti, I want to come to a point that you made earlier. You were saying, you know, if we're to shift the conversation from one being not about labour but about people, we need to understand that people are always intertwined in, you know, social networks. They have families, they have partners and whatnot, and that's something that we hear really little about when we think about migrants. I know through your research you've tracked some of these through storytelling and through narratives and whatnot. So I'm wondering if there are any kind of anecdotal or any of these stories that you can talk to us or about now of what migrants in these really precarious situations are doing and how that's affecting, you know, obviously you're unable to, you know, to visit and border closures and whatnot. What's that meaning for how they interact and gain support across borders?
Yeah, I think as our migration program has really shifted to a focus on skilled migration, I think that sometimes those questions do drop out of the discourse a little bit, because we tend to think about skilled migrants, and probably temporary migrants as well, as somehow these sort of very independent economic actors who make decisions about their mobility based on economic rationales about where they're going to earn more money or have more career opportunity. And I think that narrative leads us to, as you say, Helen, forget to think that even if somebody comes for a job opportunity or an economic opportunity, there's a bunch of other things that are going on in people's lives related to family and community, for example. So I'll just maybe pick out a couple of things from my previous research that I think are quite interesting. One is the increasing significance of partner visas and family migration in some of these long-term family stories. So partner visas are now about 80% of our family migration program. So this includes young people, or not always young people actually, people who have been living in Australia for a while and are not permanent residents and have an Australian partner who's a permanent resident or citizen. But it might also include people who've met overseas, for example, and then have returned to Australia. So you're looking there at couple relationships and sometimes family relationships where members of the family have different citizenships. And that can cause, particularly in a crisis like this, a lot of anxiety within a family. So if you imagine the situation where you have a different passport to your partner, maybe a different passport from your kids, your aging parents are in a different country, that is maybe not easy for you to access, and you don't know when you're going to be able to see them or provide the care for them that they need. And you also have concerns that border closures might affect your own status in Australia. So it's a period of time, I think, in which anxieties around families being separated or families not being able to access the support that they need is really quite high. And I think particularly when people are on temporary visas, another thing that sometimes isn't recognised is it's not just lack of access to entitlements like job seeker payments. You also, if you're a temporary visa holder, you have to pay more for everything. So that includes like really high fees to send your kids to public schools, for example, high costs for healthcare and insurance. And a lot of migrant families, recent migrant families in Australia today, mitigate some of those costs by drawing on their transnational networks. So for example, over the school holiday period, they might have the grandparents come over on visitor visas from China to provide childcare so that the parents can continue to work. That's now an option that's kind of indefinitely cut off as well. Even for healthcare, lots of the participants in my research, if they need dental surgery, for example, they'll actually fly back home to Taiwan because it's cheaper. They can go and visit family, stay with their parents, get their medical treatment, and then come home without having to pay the high costs. In Australia, I've also spoken to lots of women who are pregnant, and when they're due to give birth, they like to fly home and have the baby and have that postpartum period where their mum's there, their sisters are there, they've got that kind of cultural and economic support, and then they can come back home. So it's small examples like that for people who really live their lives drawing on the support of a transnational family. It's all of those things that are a little bit up in the air now. And I think for those of us who have very locally embedded social support and care networks, it's really hard to imagine what it would be like when the people that you're kind of depending on are not nearby. In some ways, it's interesting because we've all experienced a little bit of that during COVID. You know, we've all experienced not being able to go a few suburbs over to visit our mum and dad, you know, not being able to go interstate to see our grandparents, not being able to access family childcare when we need a break from our kids. So it's kind of interesting in a way, like some of those issues that face transnational migrant families, we're all feeling a bit of the pain of that at the moment. And maybe that's going to help us to have some empathy towards it as well.
Helen, can I just add
go on.
3 programs that I'd just like to highlight 3 programs during this COVID period, where one is a Tamil food initiative and empowering program for women, mobilizing young people, mobilizing youth, especially in universities, to provide online homework support to Tamil parents. So it's not for the children only, but it is to provide support to them. And that's the example that I was talking to you about. You know, the double disadvantage. These are the groups of people that are really facing an additional challenge. The other one is the multicultural, the business support in Western Sydney, especially to whether it's the Arabic or the Vietnamese or the Korean or the Chinese communities, but there is much more online support now to businesses, and including tips for survival if they're running restaurants or takeaway businesses or cafes, also to this group during Ramadan, and during Eid. Finally, the other one was the weekly topical interview series on subjects on isolation, sports, mental health, navigating parents at home. And basically, this is an interview series that is now alive and targeting families in Western Sydney during COVID. So these are all COVID specific initiatives and programs that are currently in place in Western Sydney during COVID.
Yeah, and I just really want to add to Melissa's comments, give a bit of a broader perspective on that. You know, across Australia, I'd say probably particularly in the Western Sydney region, but all around Australia, ethnic community organisations and kind of grassroots migrant community organisations, whether that's temples or churches or local ethnic community groups, just do so much grassroots support work, both within their communities and across the mainstream and general multicultural community. But there is such generation of support, activity, community goodwill that's actually driven at the grassroots level from these communities, and that's so important to recognise. They really, really do run so many highly effective programs, so much formal and also informal ways to support the people around them, and it's quite critical work, particularly in a crisis period like this.
Yes, Shanti, you're right. I'd say, Helen, they're not hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller ethnic agencies that are doing exactly what Shanti was referring to, stepped up during COVID in providing meals or food parcels or providing, basic essentials to these communities, but who have really stepped up. And that's what I said, they're not hundreds, but there would be thousands of smaller ethnic organizations, and not only looking after and targeting the support to their own communities, but it is keeping it open to anyone who is disadvantaged or who is in need. Especially we've seen again now, in Western Sydney, I can give you maybe 20 different names or 30 different names of organizations, because we're the CMRC is very connected on Facebook as well. And literally every day I'm seeing a new organization, or people emailing our organization and saying, can you just promote this and let these communities know? But it is not ethno-specific only, though they come from those backgrounds, but they're keeping the support open to anybody who's in need. But I agree with you, Shanti.
I mean, we saw that during the bushfires that we've just experienced as well, that there were ethnic community and migrant religious groups that were doing a lot of work to support their local areas during the bushfires too.
Yeah.
So it's not just related to this crisis.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And I think it'd be remiss of me not to mention that we're experiencing that as well here at the university. We've had a number of staff members write in and want to donate to our student hardship fund that we've set up to support our international students, which has just been fantastic. So thank you all to those people that have been doing that. Thank you very much, Melissa and Shanti. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd love to continue talking, and certainly as the policy, changes and announcements are made, this is a conversation that requires, ongoing conversation. So on the screen right now, you'll see the results of our polls today. So you see that most of the people that were on the line today, thank you all, by the way, have dialed in from the Western Parkland city, so local to us. Well, to me here in Parramatta at the moment. To the question, how much longer do you think international travel to and from Australia will be banned? 55% of people say 6 months minimum. That'd be interesting, the fact that Scott Morrison wants to open the economy in July, but if those international borders are still closed, it'd be interesting to see if that's even achievable. And I might just scroll down because this was an interesting one, and I'll get Shanti and Melissa your responses. Which one of the songs is your lockdown anthem? Mine's certainly Shepherd. What do you think? I'm so lonely I could cry. The Lonely Shepherd, Dancing with Myself. I'm so lonely, leave me alone. Pub with no beer.
Oh, look, I'm going to have to go with Pink. I'm very much like an early 2000s like pop music junkie, so I'm going to go with Pink.
Okay.
Oh.
And how about you, Melissa?
Well, I'll go with Dancing with Myself because, you know, at this point in time when everything is so kind of down and out, I think dancing with yourself, you know, brings another energy. And I love dancing and I love song and music. And, you know, I think this just releases a lot of energy and positive, good energy out there, positive vibes.
I love the vibes. Okay, well, yeah, thank you a lot for everyone that's been tuning in every week. We appreciate your engagement. Next week, Andy Marks will be back with a special episode. I won't do a reveal. He'll want to do that. Same time, same place, 2 p.m. Wednesday. Thank you again to our guests, Shanti and to Melissa. And we will certainly be tracking this migration case as it unfolds. So stay tuned for more commentary there. See you.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks all.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you. Bye.